please join me in welcoming Anne and Dahabo.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay. And I just want to hook into the last two speakers, actually, because absolutely the 30% was never meant to be the end game or the overall target or ceiling. It was put in place because it was a tipping point where minorities ceased to be minorities, and there's a bit of science behind that. And the idea was, once you reach that tipping point, obviously we'd like to accelerate towards parity. So I'm completely with Lauriane on that sentiment. 30% Club was put in place in Britain about 10 years ago, at a time that we had less than 12% women on boards. And today on the FTSE 100, we've got something like almost 38%. So we're heading towards 40% now. So it's been successful, there's no doubt about it. But it didn't stay in Britain, it went viral. It's in 18 countries around the world and counting: Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, the US, Canada, of course, Brazil. It's moving all over Latin America now. We just opened in Mexico, and it's moving into Eastern Europe. We just opened in Poland. Because all over the world, people are waking up and saying, we want to see the business world change. Now, the 30% Club is not a club of women. It's predominantly a club of men, because the members of this club are the chairs and CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the world. And really, unfortunately, 95% of them are actually men. But the good news is that these men have stood up and said, I want to see my company become more diverse. And they've started with gender, because gender is something which, you know, regardless of your background, your race, it's a consistent thing around the world in every country. You know, the world's kind of half and half from a human race point of view. And yet women are seriously underrepresented on a global basis in the business world. And these men have stood up and said, I don't want that to continue. And I'm going to attempt to go for at least 30% women on my boards, and then further when I can. And then they've actually gone further. They've said at least 30% women in the C-suite. That's the executive at the top of companies. And in Britain, we've gone one step further to say we want at least one person of colour on every major British board. But because we're the 30% Club, we'd like 50% of those seats to be occupied by women. Again, kind of, I think Lauriane would call that a 2-for-1, the intersectionality, if you like. And actually, when we put those targets out, it was quite interesting. The chairman and CEOs rang us up in Britain and said, is that achievable? They didn't disagree with the target. They just wondered whether they could achieve it. And the good news that I could give them was, that's very achievable, having 50-50 men and women of colour, because you're already tracking at 42% women. So it's just a little tip in the balance, and it's going to be good. So I think that there is a will to do it. You heard about the NASDAQ. Companies are being measured on this now, and they're being asked to be very transparent about it. So they're really welcoming the 30% Club in so many more countries around the world.
Thank you, Anne. That's great. Dahabo, as I know all too well, the Black North Initiative. The Black North Initiative is a younger organization than the 30% Club, having been established, I guess, about 1.5 years ago. What are some of the themes and highlights you can share with us, Dahabo?
Thank you, Jay. And it's nice to see you, Anne. We've never met, but it's so great to hear from you and the work that you guys have been doing. One of the things that just really resonated with me as you were speaking was the idea that 90% are men that are part of the 30% Club. I thought this is what active allyship looks like, and the beauty of the Black North Initiative is exactly the same thing. Most of our partners and stakeholders and contributors are from communities that are not Black, because they understand not only the privilege that they have, but also the power they have and how they can start to share that and shift that. And so at the Black North Initiative, yes, we're a younger organization. I'll tell you that it doesn't feel very young. I feel as though the last 16 months, it feels a lot longer than that, just because of everything that's happened in our communities, but also the impact that contributors have had thus far. And the idea behind Black North has always been, how do we get corporate Canada to be part of the echo of solutions? We were seeing all sorts of initiative and ideas and, programs and structures that were being built. But one of the things that we noticed and was that it was happening in silo. And so how do we make sure that we are combining our efforts? Because if you can imagine the power of 500 companies coming together and saying, we are going to do this together. And not only are we going to do this together, but we are going to be accountable towards each other. And that we're going to be able to create opportunities for our communities in such a way that they're going to be standard. And it's no longer, something that we strive for, but it's actually in the fabric of the way that we function. I think that's the beauty of Black North. And you may or may not have seen that we just launched our BNI playbook yesterday. And, it's the racial equity playbook. It's 147 pages, but I can tell you that the impact of implementing that type of guide within your organizations could have a ripple effect and create generational impact. And so what we did is, we said to ourselves, if we're going to build true equity and we're going to look at the inequalities, we're going to look at what does it mean to truly be inclusive and to take into account that intersectionality that you spoke about, Anne, because it's so critical. When you look at me, you'll see I'm a Black woman, but you may not know that I'm Muslim. You may not know that I'm an immigrant, and you may not know the other parts of my identities. And so how do we make sure that we're creating a system that's conducive for that? And that is a very daunting task. And so what we are trying to do at Black North is take into account the different components of our communities and make sure that we create an environment that's going to be responsive to that. It's not going to be easy, but I think what we are at least trying to say to ourselves, and I heard the two other speakers before speaking about being intentional and being deliberate and making sure that we are translating our efforts into action. And so I think, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about the different programs and initiatives that we've launched thus far, but I think the playbook for me is probably the one thing that I can say to myself has all the components of what equity looks like. So representation, promotion, retention, vendor diversity, processes in terms of recruitment generally, looking at anti-racism, whether it's anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, gender equality. It has all these components because they all speak to each other. And it's important that if we're going to address one, that we look at the different factors of the others. And so I think for me, we're in such, I was telling the team yesterday, like what a time to be alive, I get to see this in my generation, and that's honorable work. And so, yeah, a little bit about Black North.
That's great, Dahabo. The concept of allyship, which both of you have spoken about, and intersectionality is one that's really near and dear to my heart. And Dahabo and I worked on some great events together, pulling together communities, whether it be the Asian community, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, together with the Black community, together to fight against all forms of racism and hate. And I think that's so important. But I also can't help but wonder, in terms of intersectionality and allyship, and I'll leave it to either of you to jump in, how these two campaigns, these two organizations can perhaps complement each other and support each other and amplify each other's missions.
You know what, just listening to Dahabo and the document that you've just published, it sounds like it's a how-to manual.
That's right.
Yeah, and when you get leaders in companies stand up and say we want to change the company, it doesn't mean that they know how to do it.
No.
I mean, they're setting themselves bold agendas, but then comes the question, what do I have to do internally and externally to make this happen? And often the internal piece seems a little bit more obvious to them because they're thinking about their people and how they're promoting and retaining, and they're putting in, you know, balanced slates, and they're trying to do all of that and close their gender gap and close their black pay gap and all sorts of things. But then the external piece does change according to what kind of company you are. And I find that a very interesting piece. I mean, we've already heard about value chains, supply chains, and you can think to yourself, am I using goods and services from companies that are led by Black people? Am I, women, or, any kind of, diverse measure that you want to use? And am I fairly representing them in my supply chain? But I also think that it can apply to your customer base as well. Yeah. We live in a period of stakeholder management where you are, there as a company to serve the communities you operate in, and you can't do well in a failing world. In my particular company, we work with 3 billion people on the planet, but we know that 85% of the world's day-to-day buying decisions are actually made by women. So for us to not be thinking of this and designing for this and so on, that would be just crazy. But I mean, similarly, you can go to anywhere in the world and you can look at, the racial mix, you can look at the background of people, you can segment your market so that you actually can make sure that you're empathetically covering what you're trying to distribute and whether you're doing it properly. And actually in our business, we know that financial inclusion is a big problem around the world. And many people are financially excluded because they're minorities, or sometimes they're not a minority in the case of gender, they just happen to be women. And they just have a lot less bank accounts and less access to finance, and no ability to offer collateral to run their businesses because they're not allowed to own land in their country or something like this. So all of these things, when you really start thinking about the community and the customer base, it expands beyond the borders of your company and can be incredibly powerful. And I think our two organizations, with Dahabo's "This is how you do it," with leaders who want to do it, could be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and it's crazy because, when there was a report that was done by the United Nations a few years back, in 2017, in 2018, they released it and announced that the next decade would be the decade for people of African descent. And it's because they went around the world, not just in Canada, not just in the US, but went around the world to look at the state of affairs of Black people. And it was the same across the board: lack of opportunity, lack of access to education, lack of employment, lack of financial freedom and prosperity. It was the same across the board. And so when I know that in terms of the 30% Club being able to look at leadership and how do we harness that, how do we look at CEOs and people in positions of power and decision making, and make sure that we're providing them the information that they need, and that there's visibility on what is going on the ground, and that we're promoting all of this within governments. And when I think about it, it's absolutely complementary to what we're doing. What we're trying to do is give the information. If you don't understand the makeup of what's going on with these communities, you don't have the data, you don't have the research, you don't have the scientific evidence, you're not going to do anything because you don't understand how deep the issue is. And so part of the work that we're doing, including the playbook, is really about giving you the information, the historical background, and the challenges day by day, because I think we can easily say things like 29% of Black women don't have a family doctor. We can easily say that 7 cents to the $100 that are given to Black-led organizations is incredibly low. 7 cents to $100. Like, that's how do you build capacity? How do you develop anything? I could give you all of these things, but if you don't understand where they come from or how we got to where we are today, then we're not going to know where we're going. And so I think it is absolutely complementary. What you're doing is allowing us to drive the message, and what we are doing allows you to accomplish what you need to do on your end. And so I think that's the beauty of these organizations coming in together and being being an arm and doing it shoulder to shoulder, because I think that's what that, and we're allies for you and you're allies for us, right? I think it's absolutely complementary. I just want to be able to get to a place where it just happens seamlessly, like, you know, where we don't, like, I hope I get there in my generation. It's hard to see it sometimes, and we're impatient. I'm sure all of us here are also feeling that, because we're seeing, we want to get the change done right away, but we also want to do it right. And so it's going to take time, but I think we're just in a particular window right now. I don't know if everybody feels it, but I do. There's something special happening. And I think if we can leverage this moment, it'll create an incredible impact generationally.
I'm with you, Dahabo.
Sorry, Jay.
Absolutely. Well, I've got a gazillion more questions, but we're pretty much at the final minutes of this portion. And you were going to say something. I'll let you jump in. Yeah.
I was going to agree with Dahabo. We are in a window, and you know, one of the reasons why is COVID. I mean, we're sort of balanced to create the future of work and to redesign our societies. And COVID has shown us how imbalanced we are. That's right. How unfair.
No question.
In so many different ways for different communities around the world. And we can't go on living like that. We have to live differently. And that's why I think it's a unique window.
I agree. Absolutely.
I wanted to close with a final question for Dahabo and jump in thereafter if you wish. And I noticed that there's a saying that you're very familiar with, Dahabo: lightning makes no sound until it strikes. Can you explain to us what that means to you and whether it can be applied to the advancement of women in the workplace and society at large, for that matter?
Oh, man. You're going to make me emotional, Jay. Okay. Look, there's so many meanings for that. I think a lot of people read that or have heard it, and it applies differently to people. But for me, it comes from my dear father, who's passed away a long time ago. But he would always look at me, and, you know, I was a daddy's girl. And so he'd always say to me, you're such a quiet child. And no one would believe that I'm quiet. You met me now, you know I'm not quiet, but I was. And that's because I kept everything inside, and I looked at the world and I noticed things that were wrong, and I didn't know where I fitted into all of it. And I had a lot of love for the world, and I still do, more now than I've ever done before. But my father would look at me and say, look, I hope that you find a place that is safe for you to put all your love in. Advocacy for me is that. It's where I pour my love in. But he'd always look at me and say, lightning makes no sound until it strikes. And that's because when I did speak up, or when I did do something, I did it with full force and with all of the love that I have inside of me. And so I think women are, I was going to say some of the most powerful creatures, but I think the most powerful creature. The amount of challenges and the amount of, you know, hurdles that we deal with, and the way that we have created and shifted this world. I believe that. I think women are at the forefront of that. Has been quite remarkable, and we continue at times to be looked at as a second thought. And so I am proud to have come into this world as a woman, because I think there's something very special about the way that we do things and how we do it. And the more women that you see in leadership roles, the more you see how things are done right. And I don't say that because I don't think all men don't do it right. I would not go as far as that, but I think women do things differently because there's a different understanding that we have of the world because of the experiences that we've had. And so I think all women are lightning. I really do think that. And so, but how do we empower them? How do we uplift them so that they're able to use that power?
Thank you. And thank you, Dahabo. Any parting words, Anne?
Oh, I couldn't agree more about all women being lightning. I've got to use that somehow. But, you know, and if I think about that, you know, one of the things that pleases me about that are the young women, you know, like Greta and like Malala. You know, they're just two big examples. I'm meeting so many young women around the world that are standing up for the big issues of the day, and it gives me a lot of hope.